Thank you all for coming out. We appreciate it. I know a lot of, like I said in the beginning, a lot of time, money, and energy put out here, and that you all put out to get here. So we thank you for making this a priority. And like I said earlier, I think this is the beginning of a very large or a very long conversation in our movement. Just a little bit about my story. My name is Joel Seymour. I'm the pastor here. Planted this church 14 years ago. I grew up in a small town, Logan, Ohio, one county south of here, and then I moved to another small town north of here called Canal Winchester. At the time, I think I graduated with 66 or 67 people in my graduating class. It has since been swallowed up by Columbus, and it's no longer a small town. In 22 years, things have changed. But I'm used to small towns. I went to a Christian college in a very small town in eastern Kentucky. And then out of college, I planted a non-denominational church. It was a friend of the Vineyard. Actually, we'd looked into adopting in the Vineyard. I planted that in northwest Ohio. It was a county seat. Wauseon, Ohio was the name of it. And there were 5,000 people and then a whole lot of cornfields around it. And it was probably there that I really developed, even though I grew up in a small town, it was probably there that I developed a heart for small town USA. I went up with a professor who was from that town. All the team except me were from that town. Looking back, I used to think, like, how did it go so well there? Because we made a ton of mistakes. And I used to think, it must have just been God's grace. And there was a whole lot of God's grace there. But looking back, I see a few things that made all the difference in the world. One of the things is the professor I went with, his family was very well connected to that small town. His family owned the first pizza shops in northwest Ohio that had been built outside of Toledo. They started that back in the 50s and 60s. His brother and mom still owned the local Dairy Queen. His dad had been a city council member. Their family went back generations in that town, so they were known commodities. There was a lot of consistency in their family and integrity in their family. And so that went a long way. And with the rest of the team that was from there, that went a long way in starting that church. That church went very, very well. In fact, it went so well that when I came here, and it's taken 14 years to kind of get to where we're at today, it was often discouraging those first few years because in the small town that I was in, Lancaster has probably 45,000 people. If you count the zip codes of the villages around it, it can get up to 70,000 or so. But in that town of 5,000, it just went incredibly well. There were churches there. We had the Lutheran church, the Baptist church, we had a Mennonite church, and we had an evangelical Mennonite church, and we had a Catholic church, St. Casper's, which we affectionately called St. Casper's the Friendly Church, just because it reminded us of the cartoon of Casper the Friendly Ghost. And they were great churches. They had great ministries. They were doing good things. But what we quickly learned, and me as an outsider probably even saw it more so than the folks that were from there, I quickly learned that if you didn't have certain last names, or if you weren't from certain groups, or only certain groups went to this church and other groups went to this church, and I realized there were whole groups of people that weren't being reached. And by starting a new church, a new work that didn't have a lot of those, the baggage or history, I guess would be a better word than some of those other churches, we could effectively reach lost and unchurched people. We began with a small group. We met in a high school when our opening Sunday, about 9 months in of doing small groups. We started in a high school. We looked everywhere in this town. The one bad thing about this town, there wasn't a whole lot of place to rent for Sunday only. The high school worked. Problem was the high school auditorium sat 790 people. Our small group had 14. And so we just started going around word of mouth, telling people about this. It's a great thing about small towns. You can do word of mouth advertising and it gets around. Small towns can be gossipy, and so which works to your advantage and disadvantage at times. But we invited a ton of people. We had 90 people show up at that first Sunday, and it never looked back. It just kept going. It was so great because we had the town eye doctor came because he was at another church at one point in his walk with Christ, but he really wanted to reach unreached people, and that particular church wasn't as interested. And so he hooked up with us early on when we were just 14 people and became part of our leadership team. So we had the town eye doctor that first Sunday. We had 2 rows of bikers, and you looked at the crowd and you said, well, this is quite, when I mean bikers, I mean full leathers, the whole deal. They're part of the 5th chapter, Clean and Sober motorcycle group. When you looked at the crowd, you looked at it and you go, man, what a diverse group of people from different socioeconomic scales, from different backgrounds, even races. One of the groups we tapped into in Northwest Ohio was Hispanic community. Historically, a lot of Hispanics have moved to Northwest Ohio as part of migrant farmers. And then as factories were being built, they stayed for good jobs in the factories. And they fit into one church in town, but some of the others they didn't. And all of a sudden we started attracting Hispanics. So it's a very diverse crowd, except there was one common thing among this group. They were unreached. They were unchurched. When we did surveys, we had 80% of the people were unreached or dechurched, meaning they'd been a part of church a while back but had not been involved in the last year or two. It was an incredible thing. And like I said, it kind of set me up for some discouragement when I moved down here because it was a whole lot more work when we moved down here. But in that process of seeing that, I just saw an incredible move of God. We were the only contemporary vineyard-style church in town, the only empowered evangelical, if you will, if that's the label that we want to describe ourselves with. We were the only one in town like that. And so instantly we started attracting people that were not attracted to any other place. We could do simple things and people would be attracted. We would do downtown concerts. So the last downtown concert I was a part of was actually the first one that we planned, but it was the last event that I helped plan before I moved down here in '98. We had 500 people show up word of mouth just because they heard music and there was nothing else to do in this small town. And people are just walking down the street with lawn chairs. It was just crazy. Again, I know this doesn't happen all the time. Again, it's taken 14 years. It hasn't been as easy here. But in that moment, I saw this is what can happen in small towns. It was in the mid-'90s. We started getting together. There wasn't really a spirit of competition among the churches, so we were able to work together. We had good relationships, and we began doing a once-a-month youth rally together, and which was new in that city. Again, it was a small town of 5,000, lots of cornfields, and so we started putting on big things. And one time we put together, and some of you are familiar with this band, but we put together a concert with Res Band, Christian hard rock act, and nobody had ever seen anything like that in this town. And the only place we could rent that time was the Evangelical Mennonite Church. And so we put on this concert that's in their Family Life Center that has a daycare attached to it. And Rez shows up from Chicago, and every kind of piercing and colored hair and spikes that you can see. And they put on this concert, and you should see the people picking up their kids from daycare. I thought, this is not going to go well. We're never going to be able to use this church again. And Rez came in and just flat laid it out. And the lead singer shared a sermon, just laid out the gospel. And there was a guy from our church that came. Actually, I don't know that he'd ever been to our church yet. His daughter had been. And the reason he came is he got suspicious of us because his daughter liked going to church. And he thought, I better go check this thing out because teenagers shouldn't like going to church. This is probably a cult. So he came to this Res Band concert, which I thought, man, it's going to blow his hair back. And it did. Glenn lays out the gospel. He ends up going forward and giving his life to Christ. His whole family gives their life to Christ. He ends up just growing in the Lord, became my wife and I's best friends, such best friends that when we moved down here, they bought 18 acres and built a cabin in the county south of us so that they'd have a place to come and visit. And so they live 3.5 hours away, but they come down on weekends and visit and then come to this church from time to time. He gets saved. There is no history in his family of salvation that he can find. He ends up developing a heart for single moms. We start a Thanksgiving meal pass out in Wauseon. What we would do is we'd have the service, we'd have worship on a Sunday. Some of you guys have done this kind of thing. And then instead of a sermon, we had our people just take full meals to 120 single moms in the community. We did this several years in a row before I left. When you do 120 meals in a community of 5,000, that makes an impact. He headed up the single moms oil change. You know, you've done these servant evangelism things too. What I'm saying is what we begin to see is as we begin to do this in a town of 5,000, there was major cultural impact. And what we ended up having is businessmen would approach us and say, hey, I heard what you guys did. These are guys that weren't involved in church. They would come up to us and say, hey, when you do that next year, can I help pay for it? Yes, we'd be happy to allow you to do that. that was really where I developed a heart for small towns. And then I moved here to Lancaster, and now as an APCL for this area. And really, when I say this area, we're on the edge of Columbus, and then some of our churches in our area, some of the guys are here tonight. They're in small towns or on the edge of Appalachia. And for the last 2 years, we've been discussing in our area meetings, how can we start reaching southeastern and eastern Ohio? Then we started pulling out the map of the vineyard nationally, and we just started noticing huge pockets of areas that are consisting of small towns that nobody's going to, and we thought we got to do something about this. And so that's kind of how we have got to this point. I'm teaching tonight not as an expert. People have began asking me questions because they saw we're doing this conference and stuff. I'm doing the conference, and I'm bringing in special speakers because I don't have the answers. I want to know how to do this. I want to figure out, how can we reach Appalachia? How can we go to the Ozarks? How can we do Colorado? How can we reach into these rural and small town areas? But I did want to launch us with tonight, even though I'm not an expert and have the answers, I did want to just share a few things that I think will help us as we converse. Already, today I did an interview with for our regional conference. We're going to show a little video about Small Town USA at our regional conference. And one of the first things the videographer asked me was, he just said, well, why go to small towns? I mean, there's plenty of churches in small towns. Aren't people reached? And I thought, oh, all right away, I'm hearing the misnomer. And so I thought, I know all you are into this, you're into small towns, but I thought I would at least give us some ammunition and some good answers for when people ask, why are we doing this? The first question I have, and you see that if you have your outline with you, is just simply, why hasn't the vineyard historically planted in small towns? And to prepare this talk, I've talked to people like our speakers, Ross Nelson, Jim Egley. I've also talked to guys like Kirk Yamaguchi out in Colorado. I've talked to Dave Jacobs out in California, smallpastors.com. It's a great website you should look at. He coaches about 50 vineyard pastors a month. He's retired now as a vineyard pastor, and he has his finger on the pulse of small towns and small churches. And so the information I got here is both from my own research and looking up in books, but also from these interviews. Here's what I heard as I interviewed guys. Why hasn't the vineyard done this historically? One of the first answers is very simple, is people just haven't felt called. So one of the reasons is just people have not felt called. But the more I investigated that, and investigated this question of why hasn't a vineyard historically planted, I also began to realize, I don't know that we've created an atmosphere for people to be called. I think a lot of times we've just checked that off of even, God wouldn't want you to go to a small town. We haven't even made that an option. The vineyard was birthed at the height of the church growth movement in the 70s and 80s. Our founder of the vineyard movement, John Wimber, was the first head of the Fuller Evangelistic Institute, which became the Church Growth Institute. And the church growth movement historically has been about quick growth. And there's nothing wrong with growth, but the perception has been that the only way you could do it is in urban areas or in suburban areas. And so metro areas became the real prize. Our founder himself added to this perception at times. In preparing for this conference and interviewing these different folks and others I haven't mentioned, one answer became to emerge. He said, I don't know if John Wimber, the founder of the vineyard, ever said this intentionally, but the perception is that he discouraged people from planting in small towns. And so that mentality is kind of continued today, that we will plant in suburbs, we will plant in metro areas, but we have left small towns and micropolitan areas untouched. As I interviewed, another common answer emerged of why hasn't the vineyard done this, and it is this, that we don't value small. We don't value small. This is just a cultural thing. This isn't a vineyard thing. For goodness sakes, we shop at Costco and Sam's Club. We get toilet paper and gross now. Everything's huge. We supersize our meals. But that filters into the church, and not just the vineyard, but I think all denominations. When's the last time you've been at a major conference where the keynote speaker was the pastor of a church of 60? It doesn't happen, does it? The books on my shelf, the guys I like to read. I was talking with Bill Fuller, who planted out of Logan Vineyard, and we were talking a little bit about this. Or he planted out of here and planted the Logan Vineyard. We were just talking, the books we like to read. The reason we're reading Francis Chan is because he had pastored a church of 10,000 at one point and got a publishing contract. I don't read a book of a guy that pastored 120 church because They never got contacted by Zondervan or somebody else to publish, you know? And so we create this mentality that bigger is better, and it can begin to create an atmosphere and an environment, I think even whether it's conference programming or publishing or even coaching, where we leave out small towns or even small church pastors. And that the stark reality is the majority of our vineyard churches and our movement are less than 200 people. You know, and so, and yet we present a picture that we can all be a mega church at times. And I don't think that's intentional. I just think that comes off in church culture, and not just our movement, but lots of different movements. And so I think it's going to take a change in our thinking. Now listen to me carefully. I'm not against mega churches. I was planted out of the Columbus Vineyard when we moved down here, and they've resourced us and been great for us, and we use them all the time. I'm not against growing churches either. I want to grow and reach lots of people. I'm not against metro areas or big churches. But if we're going to reach the unreached in the USA, I think we're going to have a paradigm shift in our thinking. I was talking to Bill, and Bill's here, planted out of this church, 20 miles south of here in Logan, Ohio. It's the county seat of Hocking County. There's 5,000 people roughly there. And Bill has 60 people coming, just acquired a building somewhere around in the 13,000 to 14,000 square foot. It was an old National Guard armory that had been converted by a nonprofit into a community center, and then that nonprofit didn't make it, and so they were able to get the building. It has a gymnasium, a weightlifting room, several classrooms and offices, so it's just primed to do something with. And it's hard. You know, he's 3.5 years into this, and at times it's a discouraging process. Those of you that planted know that it's discouraging, and man, we're just busting our tail, and we have 60 people. And I said, listen, Bill, you're in a town, we were just talking about this last week, you're in a town of 5,000 people when you have 60 people. That's over 1% of the population going to your church. It's taken us 14 years, and we're barely kissing 1%. I mean that metaphorically. We are barely kissing 1% of the folks in Lancaster, you know? If you're to do that in the Columbus metro area, which almost has 1 million people, you'd have to have a church of 10,000 to reach 1%, you know? So, I mean, just put it into perspective. We have to change the way we think. So, enough about some of the reasons why we haven't done this. Why small town USA? Why plant in small town USA? When somebody asks you, as you feel called to do this, and somebody says, well, why would you go to a place that's small? Why would you go to a place of 2,000 or 5,000 or 10,000 people or 20,000 even? Why would you go there? Well, the first reason is I think there's a biblical reason. You know, we're all familiar with the passage of Matthew 9 where Jesus has compassion on the crowds and says the harvest is great. Then he tells his disciples to pray for the workers. And then I love how chapter 10 begins because he goes, oh, prayer answered, you're it. You know, you're called. I'm going to release you to go do it. But listen to where that passage begins in Matthew 9, verse 35. It says this, Jesus went through all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom and healing every disease and sickness. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field. Did you notice that before Jesus had compassion on the crowds and before this commissioning of the 12, Jesus ministers to all the towns and villages? I mean, that's a discussion our outreach director, Malcolm, and I have been having of that phrase, all the towns and villages. He didn't say stay in the metro areas of Jerusalem or Capernaum or Caesarea. Hey, check out don't stray from the burb of Bethany. He went to all the towns and villages. All means all. You know, he went everywhere. And being good vineyardites, we know that he only went where his Father had sent him and wanted him to go. And apparently the Father wanted him to go to all the towns and villages. This didn't just stay with Jesus. It was given to the 12. When he commissions the 12 in Matthew 10:11, the very next chapter, it says, whatever town or village you enter, search there for some worthy person and stay at their house until you leave. Again, he didn't restrict the 12 to metro areas or suburban areas. He said, whatever towns or villages you enter, go there. And I think the Father's commissioning us to go in those same places. We all know the Great Commission, you know. It's go into all the world. In Acts 1, it's go to Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth. You see, it occurred to me this morning as I was thinking about this, we are comfortable with that when we talk missions. I mean, how often do we encourage missionaries to go to a remote village in the Amazon or in Kenya? But yet when it comes to planting and doing church in our own country, we often discourage people from going to remote towns and villages. See, I think Jesus wants us to go to all the towns and villages around. There's a couple other reasons why I think we are to do this small town USA thing. One is a cultural reason. You know, after years and years of America becoming more and more urban, last I checked, about 80% of our population lives in the top 350 cities, so we're very urban. The trend is beginning to slowly turn around. USA Today writer Wanda Urbanski wrote an article a decade ago in USA Today. She said this: "The yearning is there. We grew up emotional and geographical transients, but we're looking to put our roots down by moving to small towns." You know, as boomers retire, we're seeing them move back to their hometowns. We've benefited from that here. Jim and Carolyn Dobemeyer were people who lived in Pickerington, a bedroom community in a very growing suburb of Columbus. He worked in the concrete jungle of Columbus in the Department of Education building as a statistician for the Department of Education, very gifted, very wise man. And when they got to retirement age, they decided to retire early in the early 50s and to move back to Lancaster to take care of some ailing parents. And they got plugged into this church. And this was a very different church than the church they had been in, a high church Methodist church. It was very different for them, but they began coming here when we were at the YMCA. And since they were retired and had time on their hands, they wanted to make an impact in their city. They had both grown up in this city, and when it was a much smaller town at the time. And so they took over our food pantry. And they took it from something that served maybe 50 or 80 families a month to we acquired a small church building on the poorest side of town, and now they serve 400 plus families a month. And it's largely because some retirees moved back to their hometown. And that's happening all over the U.S., where they're moving back, they're retiring from government or factory jobs, and they have time on their hand, and they go back. And when they go back to their small towns, they're looking for the kind of churches they had in their bigger towns. And so there's a void there that I think we can help fill just in that, even reaching people who are moving back to those areas. Besides just retired folks returning home, there's also people who've never lived in a small town who are heading that way. For some people, it's the promise of safety or tight community or slower pace or scenic living. Business opportunities are drawing other people. You know, the internet has shrunk the globe. Forbes now, every year, lists the top 10 small towns to do business in. They're paying attention to this. Because the internet has changed the way we do things. I referred to Dave Jacobs, the guy of smalltownpastors.com. He retired to a very small town in California, and I told you he coaches 50 vineyard pastors a month. He does that via Skype. You know, I mean, that's his retirement, that's how he earns his income, but that's also how he's coaching. He does it via Skype. The internet has shrunk things. There are more and more articles and books being written on how medium to large corporations can move their headquarters to small towns. This is beginning to happen in our day and in our time. In our area of the country, Northeast Ohio, which has been rural, is beginning to have a boom because of fracking. And so there are oil companies moving in, people are getting jobs. North Dakota has seen that. I don't know if our folks that are here from Colorado are in the area that it's happening, but there are areas of Colorado that is happening where there are jobs to be had because of natural gas production and oil production. So some of these small towns are beginning to grow again. In his book, Big Dreams in Small Places, which I'm sure many of you have read by Tom Neville, he says that people moved back to small towns because they're safe, friendly, relaxed, clean, and quiet. He goes on to say, Psychology Today reports that small towns provide the kind of environment for sound mental health. In the 80s, we saw 1.4 million people leave small towns. In the 90s and 2000s, we've seen 1.8 million return to small towns. So there is a move happening there. With small town dynamics, it may be hard for many of them to plug into older established churches. And for many of those movers who are already following Jesus, they'll be looking for a vibrant, life-giving, relevant contemporary church with good children's ministry and spirit-engaged worship. Those are the cultural reasons, I think, to do Vineyard Church in small town USA. There's also some practical reasons. The most practical reason I can think of is 78 million Americans live in small towns and rural areas, and they're unreached. just as unreached as the metro areas. Most of the people will say, when you look at stats, about 2/3 of Americans are unreached in small towns, and rural residents are no different. I did a study on our county is not, there's parts of it that are very rural. You're in one of them, outside the city limits. But there's a lot of people in our county. We have about 145,000 people in our county, most of that north of here because of Columbus. We're considered a conservative county. We have a lot of churches. In fact, we have 135 churches in our county. But here's the deal. The average church in Fairfield County has 67 people going on Sundays. That's 9,450 people attending church on Sundays out of 145,000 people. There's a lot of work to do. This is not just, hey, Boston has 2% church attendance, or Vegas has 1%. This is in the places we live. And they need churches where people will find that are doing something a little different, that fit a niche where people apparently aren't being reached yet. The other churches are doing a great job. They've reached their niche. There's room for other churches to come in and reach another group of people. I refer again to the county where the Fullers are at. Hocking County has 29,000 people. The county seat has 5,000 people in it. The best numbers I could find is there are 48 churches in Hocking County. You start doing the math. I mean, let's just say, let's be generous. I'm from Hocking County, so I know this not to be true. But let's be generous. Let's say there's 100 people attending on average those 48 churches. That's 4,800 people going to church out of 29,000. And yet you look at a county like Hocking County, you drive through it, it looks like, Americana, the way it should look, or the way people picture it should look, or whatever. And you go through, and yet vast majorities of people are going to church. In my state, they just ran an article in the Columbus Dispatch of the heroin problem. The city you're in today, Lancaster, Ohio, is number 2 on the list for the heroin problem. The number 1 city is Portsmouth, Ohio, population 20,000. Not Cleveland, not Cincinnati, not Toledo. These are people that need Jesus. And so there's a very practical reason. I looked at some data, and I know I'm throwing a lot of data at you, so I apologize for that. If you're not into it, there'll be inspirational stories, I'm sure, given by Jim and Ross later when they talk. But I was just thinking, how ripe is our region for the gospel? I looked at Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, and Kentucky and West Virginia. I wasn't even looking, when I was looking at towns, I wasn't even looking at the narrowest definition of small towns, which would be about 2,000 people to 15,000 people. I was looking at the government's category of micropolitan. What micropolitan is, if you're unfamiliar with it, is it's a town from 10,000 to 50,000 that is pretty much self-sustaining, that is not part of a metro area. It's not a suburb. It's not a bedroom community. It stands on its own. In fact, by the government's definition, there's now enough commuters in my town the last 10 years that we're considered a bedroom community here in Lancaster. So I was looking at these towns that stand on their own, 10 to 50,000. Some of them will get bigger than that because of the villages around, but the core town is 10 to 50,000. And just listen to some of this. This was astounding to me. Ohio has more micropolitan towns than any other state in the union. We have 29 of these areas. The average is, if you include the villages that touch these core towns, the average population is 59,000. Well, take a guess at how many vineyards are in these 29 micropolitans? 6. I mean, these are good-sized towns. We're not even talking about going to Podunk, USA, or a town of 200. We're talking about places of 10 to 50,000 people. Michigan has 16 micropolitan areas. They have 3 vineyards in them. Kentucky has 17, they have 3 vineyards. Indiana has 24 micropolitan areas, averaging 41,000 people. We have 1 vineyard out of the 24 micropolitan areas. Of the 86 micropolitan areas in Indiana, Kentucky, Ohio, and Michigan, we have 12 vineyards. West Virginia has 4 micropolitan areas, and we have no vineyards in them. In fact, we have one vineyard in the whole state, in Wheeling. These are towns that are vibrant and growing and self-sustaining. They don't need a metro area, and they are screaming for vineyard-style churches. And if we aren't planting them in those cities or towns, I know the data is even worse for towns of 2,000 to 15,000. Well, there's another reason, too, why we should plant in small town USA, and that is a vineyard reason. And here's the vineyard reason. God has given us a rich tradition and rich heritage. We are blessed to have some great values embedded into our DNA. Spirit-empowered life, justice, a heart for the poor, naturally supernatural, power evangelism, worship that touches the Father's heart. Those are just a few of the values that come to mind. But one of our primary callings has always been church planting, reaching the unreached, to spread those values to people, countries, cities, and yes, even towns and villages who don't know Jesus. We're blessed this week to have Michael Gatlin with us, and he's going to share his vision tomorrow some with us before our Q&A session. And he's the new, if you don't know Michael, he's the new National Director for Church Planting of Vineyard USA. And God's given him an incredible vision. And I say that because I do believe it's from God. And the vision is that we plant 750 churches in the vineyard in the next 10 years. You're going to hear about that vision tomorrow. Michael might, I haven't talked to him about it. He might even hit you up to commit to planting a few of those churches. He likes doing that. Numerically, I don't believe we can accomplish that vision of 750 if we don't target small towns. I don't think we can just saturate metro areas and suburban areas. I don't even think we could financially do it as a movement to hit urban areas. I think we've got to begin looking that our most bang for our buck are these small towns. Where you can go in, as Jim Egley will share tomorrow, and find the cost of living down and the cost of doing church down. I know several churches that are servicing 200 to 300 people whose monthly rent is $1,000 a month. That's a far cry from what we're paying here. I think financially, the best bang for our buck, church planting wise, and doing multi-sites, is small town USA. I also think we can make the most cultural impact that way too. Because now we have whole towns that get captured by the kingdom vision and by God. Not just little pockets in the city, but we can actually influence a whole town. Let me say it again. We must target micropolitan areas, towns, villages, and rural areas if we're to accomplish this God-given vision. My area, represented by 6 different vineyards, we have a saying that small town USA is the most over-churched, unreached area in the U.S. There's a lot of churches there. In a lot of small towns, there's not a lot of people going to them, and it's totally unreached, and we can do something about that. Another vineyard reason why I think this is why we should be planting small towns. There's a vineyard reason. Another one is many of you know of the vineyard's restructuring, from splitting up regions to even a new national director. I was at the National Leadership Retreat a year ago when they rolled out what the changes would look like as far as the regions. And if you get a chance, I think they just posted this week on vineyardusa.org. You should take a look at it and see what your region looks like. When I saw the regions split up, I was very, very encouraged by what I saw, because when I looked at my region and when I looked at many of the regions around the U.S., I think the way we're going to be split up now and divided up to make them smaller regions actually is going to encourage small town planting. Here's why. If you look at my new region that we'll be in Central Ohio, Columbus, in the northeastern part of Ohio, but not up to Cleveland. We'll have all of western Pennsylvania. We'll have all of West Virginia. There's about 2 major urban areas there, Columbus and Pittsburgh. The rest is small town USA. I mean, from here to the river, it's county seats of 5,000 or below, except Athens, and it doesn't count because it's the home of OU. But everything else is small. I mean, if my region's going to take church planting seriously, we do need more churches in the Pittsburgh area, and there are some efforts now to begin that. But if we're going to take that seriously, I mean, we can't just say, okay, more and more and more and more in these metro areas. We've got to begin looking at these other places. One of my goals is I just turned 40 in January, and I'm thinking, okay, I've got, 30 years of great energy left, I hope. And if I take care of this thing that God's given me, this vessel. And I thought, what do I want to do the second half of my life? my goal is, and our church leadership's goal is, and I don't know how to do this yet, it's one of the reasons we're hosting this thing, is I look at maps of eastern and southeastern Ohio, and my goal is that by the time I retire, there's a vineyard in every county seat. That's what I want to see happen. And I want to challenge the guys in my area, and they're into it, they're thinking about it, they're talking about it too. And that's what I want to see. We can do this thing. The vineyard reason is that we have been challenged to plant this, and the way the regions have split up, it's going to help us, I think, fulfill that vision. The last vineyard reason, and I think it's a move of God, and maybe I'm leveraging this for my own thing that I'm excited about, which is Small Town USA, but I think who's been picked as national director is part of this. Phil Stroud, if you're unaware, he's from Maine. Now he's done megachurch. He's been in large cities. He's been a missionary. What I love about Phil and how God has picked him to be the new national director of the Vineyard is that I think he brings together a lot of pieces of the pie. You know, he's not just one stream. He brings the mission component and the planting component and the urban component and the rural component. He brings it all together. And what I love about when I see him coming out of Maine is that he has actually had his church plant and do sites already in small town USA. I mean, you think about it. He's not from LA. He's not from Houston. He's not from Anaheim. I mean, is there anything big in Maine besides lobster? I mean, there's not a lot there, you know. And yet he is now in charge of our movement, of giving us vision and leadership. He has a heart for this, and he is behind the discussions that we're starting here. In fact, I'd started talking to Phil before he was even on the radar screen of being national director, just saying, this is what we want to do. We want to do a small town thing. I heard you're doing it in Maine. You know, any suggestions? He talked to me. As soon as he became national director, I fired off an email and said, hey, would you be willing to say a few words about Small Town USA to encourage the people? This was back last summer when I sent it to him, and we started dialoguing over the fall. He said, sure, I'll do that. And he cut a video for us, an 18-minute video of his passion for Small Town USA. And we want to show that, because I want you to know that this deal about planting in Small Town USA, I know there's a small group of 50 of us gathered here for this, and it can seem like we're all by ourselves doing this thing. I want you to know from the very top of our movement, our national director is behind this effort. He sent me an email this morning. He said, I'm praying for you guys. I'm jealous I can't be there because of my schedule, but I am behind this discussion. And he has plugged it over and over for us, and I think you should hear from his own mouth how he is behind Small Town USA. So let's show that video now.
Hey folks, my name is Phil Strout. I'm the senior pastor here at Pathway Vineyard Church in Lewiston, Maine. And I've been asked to share with you a few thoughts during your Small Town USA conference. Reaching unreached in small rural areas, I think, is the theme of your gathering. And it's close and dear and very real to my heart. I was born and grew up in a very small town in the state of Maine, one of the smallest states in the United States. I think at the time that I was living in the small town, it was around 2,500 or 2,800, something like that. And when I say born and grew up there, until I left high school, I lived in that town. There is presently a vineyard church in that town. I did not plant it. It was planted out of this church here in Lewiston. It was planted and pastored by a man named Dick Ray. And honestly, that church is one of the best churches that I know in the entire vineyard, and it is in a town of less than 3,000 people. They are a church that is probably one of the more connected churches with the community that I have seen anywhere. And I just love this conference and the idea of bringing this up, stirring this, because the reality is we have hundreds and hundreds of small towns and villages here in the state of Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont. And I remember several years ago I had a long conversation with a bunch of the vineyard guys out in Montana, and we were talking on this subject. And so I'm just thrilled that you folks drew this together, are making this an issue, looking at it as a mission field, and I want to say hoorah, hoorah. I think it's great. I have lived and pastored in large cities, and I've also lived and pastored in smaller cities. I personally believe that there is like this unseen harvest all across rural areas, because many of the, and I can't speak for every piece of the country. That's just, there wouldn't be any authenticity in that, because I don't know the reality all over the United States. But I know here in Maine we have had to tweak our methodology. We've had to really look hard at say, okay, we've only got the largest population center in the state of Maine has about 200,000 people. If you put all these little cities and towns together in the greater Portland area. I happen to live in Lewiston. It's a city of 35,000. And Lewis and Auburn, twin cities, they combined to maybe 60,000, and it's the second largest population center in this state. So just between the Portland and Lewiston area, 25% of the population of the state lives in those two cities. So it's a big deal, and we realize the way we've been planning here in the East and where we have so many large cities that if we only do it one way, we feel we were going to be a little challenged. So one of the things I want to say during this few minutes on this interview is we're going to have to get creative, number one. Now, I don't know anybody, at least I haven't had many people knocking down the door here saying, I want to go to Dixfield, Maine. I want to go to Crawford Notch, New Hampshire. I want to go to, St. Johnsbury, Vermont. And they're willing to go knowing they'll, the smallness of the demographic, the chance of working, full-time in a church are pretty slim. We're just going to have to find new ways to do this. One of the things we've incorporated here at Pathway is the whole issue of multi-site. And I know that Jim Egley is at your conference, so I'm sure he'll fill you in on that. I don't want to duplicate what Jim's going to present. I know what they're doing there in Illinois and other places, but we have found that it's another tool in our tool belt. And I think that's one of the big things that we're going to have to take a good look at is just what are some of the other ways than just a pastor going in, a husband and a wife and a husband going in with a few people, starting a small group and building it up, getting it into 2 or 3 small groups, 4 small groups, begin to have some level of public service. The whole methodology that we've used, which is wonderful, and it's working. I've done it, and I've done it a number of times. I've coached dozens of people in the planting of churches, but I think in this, it's if we only have one tool, we're going to be challenged. And so the multi-site has given us an opportunity. We now operate at 2 sites. The end of February of 2012. I think your conference is in April, so this is going to be old news. By the time you get it, we probably would have opened our 3rd site in a town about 30 minutes north of here. And we've also opened a venue, which is part of our site here. Now that is reaching into a part of the community that is elderly and physically handicapped, etc. There's a big housing project. And we have found that out of that complex, there's 3 people that come to our church here. But every time we do a special event at that complex, 30 or 40 people can come. So what we've done is we're now opening a Sunday night venue at that complex, but it'll be their regular service every week, every Sunday, 6 o'clock, and they will become their own venue. We have a guy and a gal who are going to pastor that. There'll be a venue pastor. It's just another way of reaching that personally we hadn't thought much about up until now. So even though it is challenging, we believe we're onto something here. I think our first site was about 30 minutes from here. We've also planted several churches out of this church here in Lewiston. So it's not either or. It's not the regular way we've always planted churches or the multi-site. I'm a both and type guy. I just believe that you know, when we were introducing the idea of multi-site to our congregation, I sat right at this table, and I brought out my tool belt. And I'm not much of a fix-it guy. I don't use tools a whole lot. So, I mean, it's pretty easy to know. My tool belt that day, it had one rusty screwdriver in it. And then my associate, Alan Austin, he came out and he sat here at the table with me in the front of this auditorium, and he had his tool belt that he really does use all the time, and he probably had 40 or 50 tools in that belt, and it was just a visual, but an illustration of who would you want to come to your house and work on your house? The guy with a tool belt with one tool, or a guy with a tool belt with 30 tools that looked used, or mine, rusty, hadn't been used for a long time, his all used and shiny and taken care of, and you'd want him at your house. That's the way it's going to have to be. If the conversation is how to plant churches in rural America, small towns, medium-sized towns, towns that other people are overlooking, some towns where there's church buildings, there's just no congregations in them, because they might have been churches that were started by circuit riders, even out in our part of the country, 40, 50, 60, 100 years ago. We have so many antique stores in this state that at one point were churches. And so we're going to put as many tools in our tool belt as we can to tackle this. I think part of this issue is the fact that there's been such an encroachment into even our understanding of successful pastoring, or successful churches have to be large churches. Well, if we don't tackle that presupposition, we're dead in the water. Because, I mean, I think large churches are wonderful when they are and where they are. But I don't think it's by any way, shape, or manner the measure of success. If you're in mid-state Maine and you're living in rural areas, if the measure is the who's coming on a Sunday morning, these aren't going to be mega churches. They're going to be good community churches. Dick Ray, and I know, I bet there's several of you there at this conference that could share this story. Dick Ray, honestly, he's just a phenomenon. He has done a wonderful job at planting and pastoring and sustaining. I think the church must be 14 years old now, and they're in the life, the fabric of that community in rural Maine. So can it be done? You betcha. Yes, it can. Is it hard work? Absolutely. Dick planted his church more of a traditional way, hived off a fairly good amount of people from this church. But that wasn't any guarantee, as many of you know, that if church planted, it doesn't matter how many people you start with. Many of those, a year later, 2 years later, aren't even with you. So we know it can be done. We know it should be done. Can you do it? I bet you can. I think you can. I look forward to. I have several months here before I become the national director of the Vineyard, but that is the ministry and the job that I have been given, and I'm really looking forward to it, because I want to bring all of these conversations front and center on like this, the tool belt being filled with different methodologies. I think we've got a lot of creativity in the Vineyard, and we need to unleash that and go for it. And I think we're going to be surprised in the next few years with Michael Gatlin leading us with the idea to plant 750 new churches. Boy, a lot of those are going to be in small town USA. And anything that I possibly can do to assist in that, to cheer for it, I'm looking forward to it. Ideas, creative ideas, out of the box ideas. That's really what it's going to take. But there's never going to be a substitution for hard work. It's never going to be a substitution for sowing in tears and reaping with joy. There's never going to be it's only me and Jesus and we're giving it our best. I mean, that's just part of ministry. So So anyways, my contribution, I wished I could have been there for this conference, but my contribution is just to encourage you that I think we can do this. I think you can do it. I love it that all of you are having this conversation, and you're sharing with one another, you're preaching to one another, you're responding, you're probably doing some ministry time, and I think all of that is just it's just fabulous. So please bring everything that you're talking about to your regional conferences. Do some workshops. I imagine you're going to have enough time from the time that you do this conference to when you'll have your regional conferences that bring this up in the workshops. Who are you recruiting? What are you recruiting them to? The different methodologies that could be used, that are being discussed there at your conference. Through the years, well, let me put it this way. I remember doing, let's say early 90s, 90, 91, 92, 93. I remember doing several workshops at national conferences and regional conferences for the Vineyard. So it's, we're talking 20, 22 years ago. And I would do a lot on cross-cultural missions, because that was the basis for which I came into the Vineyard. Was I was a missionary in South America when I met the Vineyard. I didn't meet the Vineyard here in the U.S. But I remember doing those workshops, and they were so poorly attended. And the 12 people that would come were zealots about cross-cultural missions. Most of them had taken their perspectives course, and anything cross-cultural they would go to. And I remember those days of just continuing on, bringing the word, talking about the nations, talking about that, and then introducing with others the idea of partnerships, and how that has had its own evolutionary reality, and now to see the job that Mark Fields and Craig Simonian and all of the missions task force guys and gals have done, the way the training they've done, the preparation, the soul care that they've given their workers. I'll tell you, it is amazing, really, the job that group has done. And I have an inkling that maybe this is probably the one that you're doing right now, the first conference on small town America or planting rural churches. This is the very beginning of probably a very long journey. But boy, thank you. Thank you for tackling it. Thank you for sticking with it. I've got other thoughts on this, but we'll have this conversation as we go. But I do want to encourage you. Yeah, you're bringing something good to the Vineyard, and I will do everything I can to make you empowered and blessed, and really go for it and bring this. Be our conscience in this. Champion this issue of small town America, and we will see where it takes us. But don't grow weary in the day of small beginnings. I don't mean that as upon small, but there's thousands of communities that need Vineyard churches. They're just not great population centers. Although we have population centers that need vineyards too. So it's not either or, it's both and. You're bringing this to the table. I really appreciate it. And count me as one of your fans. So God bless you guys. I look forward to a long conversation and actually action in this area. So God bless small town America and vineyards in all these towns. God bless.
I want to tell you the story of Jenny Gravely, and I'm hoping Jenny can make it to one of our sessions. She's north of Columbus, 2 counties north of Columbus in Morrow County. Jenny is a mom who has 2 boys in their 20s. She's raised a family. She went to VLI. She did an internship at Columbus a while back. She got involved in Danny Meyer's church in the Vineyard of Delaware County, which is just outside of Sunbury, Ohio, which has like 474 people. But the county is growing, and Danny's church is a large church in that community. But Jenny is from Morrow County, which has maybe 34,000 people. And she started developing a heart for that community. Years ago, she had a small group there, and that small group tried to reach out to a trailer park, did an outreach event, was going to start a small group Bible study in the trailer park, and it never panned out. It never grew. Jenny went on, like I said, do her internship, be a part then of Danny's church. And she went to Danny, and she said, Danny, I feel like I'm supposed to reach Morrow County for Christ. They need a vineyard-style church. I'm going to Ashland Seminary, get my MDiv, but I want to plant a church. And Danny said what Danny says to every church planter, well, why don't you start a small group and see what happens? And so she started a small group. It was a women's small group. And she was still going to Danny's church, but then doing this women's small group in Morrow County. And a lady came up to her one Sunday at the vineyard there in Sunbury and said, I recognize you. And she said, you came to my trailer park years ago to try to do an outreach event. And they said, yeah, we did. They started talking. And she goes, I wasn't interested in God, but now I'm seeking God. She said, well, why don't you come to my women's small group? She ends up leading her to Christ at that women's small group. She was just ravaged with bitterness, and over time was able to do some forgiveness and get healed of this bitterness. And she'd been a very quiet and reserved lady, especially when talking about faith. But through this healing process and getting rid of this bitterness, she's become a very outspoken person for her faith. She's become a gatherer now. And she's gathered nieces and nephews and family members and community members. Well, they have this women's small group, and then it begins a co-ed home group, and then it begins a men's small group. And people are getting baptized out of these groups. Now, granted, this is not connected except through this lady, Jenny, through the Sunbury Vineyard, but there's not a church in Morrow County. People are getting baptized. People are buying guitars because they want to learn to play guitar so they can do worship. They're into this whole thing now. And so she goes back to Danny, Jenny does, and says, well, can we do a church night? He goes, yeah, why don't you try a Sunday night thing? She does a Sunday night thing, and it goes incredibly well. And in January, she came across an old church building in Fulton, Ohio, population literally 271 people in Fulton, Ohio, in Morrow County, and the church is $4,000. So she buys the church, and her and this ragtag group that she has that are made up not just of people from Fulton, but from Cardington, and even some from Mount Gilead. They begin working a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, and they rehab this building and get it ready for Sunday mornings. And in January, they went to Sunday mornings. They're now averaging 50 people. At Easter, they had 60 people, and they're in a town of 271 people. Now, will that thing ever be 100? I don't know. Will it ever be 150, 205? I don't know. But the kingdom has come to Fulton. There are two vineyards that are within 20 minutes of that place, but those folks aren't going to drive 20 minutes because they're loyal to their town. That's their town, man. They want a church there, and that's what's happening. Addicts are recovering in her ministry. Her right-hand couple are a husband and wife that haven't been involved in a church for years. They were de-churched. One of our other leaders is the woman I told you about that was a seed planted long ago at a trailer park that came to fruition during this process of starting a small group and starting a church. I don't know where all of you are from. My guess is you're looking at towns bigger than 271 people. But even if not, God still wants the people in those towns. And you and I can be a part of planting in those towns.